November 20th, 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The Pacific dawn breaks crimson over a horizon of smoke. The sea is calm, but beneath its surface lies a jagged maze of coral reefs, nature's fortress, sharp enough to tear through steel. Japanese bunkers crouch low along the beach, their guns aimed at the shallows. Inside, soldiers wait, confident that no tank could ever cross the reef. But beyond the surf line, something stirs. Dark silhouettes rise with the swell. They are not boats, they are machines, steel hulls with treads instead of keels. American amphibious tanks, LVTAs, crawling over the waves like creatures from another world. Their engines growl through the salt air. The first shells land among them. Water erupts in white columns. One tank disappears beneath the waves. Another surges forward, fire bursting from its turret. It claws up onto the reef, treads gripping coral, its gun roaring toward the beach. Japanese gunners hesitate. The impossible is happening. In minutes, the tanks are climbing the sands of Tarawa, where none were ever meant to land. The Empire had prepared for every invasion, except this. In 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a brutal equilibrium. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomons, fortified by an unbroken chain of islands. Each was turned into a fortress, layered with bunkers, artillery, and coral barriers designed to stop any landing cold. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy believed they had mastered the terrain. Their engineers studied every shoreline, every tide, every reef. The logic was simple. No enemy tank could cross the coral shelves that surrounded most Pacific atolls. The reefs extended hundreds of yards from the beaches, rising just below the surface at low tide. Too shallow for landing craft, too sharp for tracks, too deep for wading. Nature itself was Japan's first line of defense. By late 1942, American planners understood this grim geometry all too well. The battles for Guadalcanal and Buna had proven one thing. Infantry alone could not break fortified beachheads. On the jungle coasts of the Solomons, U.S. Marines had learned hard lessons. Without armor, assaults stalled under machine gun and mortar fire. Tanks could not be landed directly on shore, and conventional landing craft grounded on reefs long before reaching the beach. For the Americans, it became an obsession to find a way to deliver firepower across the reef. At the heart of this search was a new kind of warfare, amphibious assault on a scale the world had never seen. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps formed a combined doctrine of vertical envelopment, where naval bombardment, air power, and landing forces worked in perfect timing. But timing alone couldn't overcome geography. The reefs remained the unbroken obstacle. Engineers, officers, and designers scoured for solutions. Could tanks float? Could machines be made to swim? The answer was found not in a weapons lab, but in an unexpected place: the Florida Everglades. Before the war, a civilian inventor named Donald Roebling, grandson of the engineer who built the Brooklyn Bridge, had developed a curious tracked vehicle for hurricane rescue operations. The Alligator. Designed to travel through swamps and flooded terrain, it was slow but unstoppable, using broad treads to climb through mud and water alike. In 1940, marine observers saw a demonstration of Roebling's machine and immediately understood its potential. Here, finally, was a vehicle that could cross the surf, crawl over reefs, and climb beaches no matter their shape or slope. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps took the concept and began to refine it for war. By 1942, the first military versions, the LVT-1 landing vehicle, tracked, were rolling off production lines. Nicknamed Amtraks by their crews, these machines could carry 18 fully armed Marines and supplies straight from ship to shore. They were unarmored, unarmed, and vulnerable. But they could do what no tank could: swim through the sea and keep moving on land. At Guadalcanal and New Georgia, early LVTs ferried troops and ammunition through treacherous surf. They proved their worth instantly, but also exposed a deadly weakness. Once ashore, they were defenseless. Marine commanders demanded something more. They wanted a vehicle that could not only transport men, but fight its way onto the beach. A tank that could swim, shoot, and survive. By 1943, engineers had answered the call with the LVTA-1, a fully amphibious assault tank. It carried a 37mm gun in a turret derived from the M5 Stuart light tank. Its hull was armored, its propulsion strengthened, and its mission clear: to lead the assault waves, crush defenses, and protect the infantry as they landed. At the same time, other units began testing waterproofed versions of the M4 Sherman medium tank. With snorkels, sealed hatches, and improvised flotation gear, they could survive limited sea travel and climb. Straight-off landing craft. The transformation of the U.S. Marine Corps was underway. From light infantry to a fully mechanized amphibious force. By the autumn of 1943, American intelligence had identified the next target: Betio Island, part of the Tarawa atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Only 800 meters wide and 2 miles long, Betio was one of Japan's most heavily fortified positions in the Central Pacific. Concrete bunkers, 8-inch naval guns, barbed wire, and machine gun nests lined every inch of sand. Japanese Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, commanding the garrison, was confident. His 4,800 troops, including elite special naval landing forces, were told that 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He had reason to believe it. The reefs surrounding Betio rose just below the tide line, forming an impassable wall of coral. He expected the American landing craft to run aground and leave Marines stranded. Easy prey for machine guns, but in November 1943, the Americans would arrive with something new. Something built to defy both the reef and the prediction. The amphibious tank was about to make its debut. In the months leading up to Tarawa, American shipyards, engineers, and Marines worked feverishly to prepare for the test ahead. The Central Pacific Campaign demanded speed. The U.S. could not afford another slow, attritional fight like Guadalcanal. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Holland M. Howlin' Mad Smith knew that every island in the Japanese defensive chain had to fall in quick succession, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, the Marianas, and beyond. Success depended on one question: could the new amphibious vehicles deliver armor and firepower where it had never gone before? To answer that, the LVTA program accelerated at unprecedented pace. Factories across the United States, especially in St. Louis, Minneapolis, and New Orleans, were converted to produce the strange boat-like tanks. The Marine Corps called them amphibian tractors, or Amtraks, but the new armored versions were nicknamed Amtanks. Each LVTA-1 weighed over 26,000 pounds, powered by a 250-horsepower Continental radial engine. Its hull was watertight and streamlined for surf travel. Two large propellers at the rear pushed it through the sea at roughly 6 miles, while wide treads allowed it to crawl over reefs and sand once ashore. The vehicle's heart, though, was its turret, a compact rotating dome housing a 37mm gun and a 30-caliber coaxial machine gun. It was modest by tank standards, but lethal against pillboxes, trenches, and light emplacements. Crews quickly discovered, however, that driving an LVTA was an entirely new kind of warfare. They trained off the beaches of California and Hawaii, learning how to balance buoyancy, waves, and fire. One mistake in trim, and the tank could nose under the surf and sink within seconds. Radio operators practiced calling in naval gunfire from the churning sea. Infantry squads rehearsed, jumping from the backs of moving Amtraks into waist-deep water under simulated machine gun fire. Every element of the operation, from the sequence of waves to the coordination with air and artillery, was refined until it became a single synchronized strike. By late 1943, Marine divisions were organized into specialized amphibious task forces. Each regiment had its own Amtrak and Amtank units, integrated directly into assault planning. What had once been experimental was now doctrine. Still, the risks were immense. Even with waterproofing, the engines were vulnerable to salt water and shrapnel. Armor protection was thin, barely enough to resist small arms fire. Japanese anti-tank rifles and 75mm guns could tear through them easily. Marine commanders knew this. They also knew that without these machines, their men would be stranded hundreds of yards from the shore, pinned down and slaughtered on the reefs. So the decision was made. The LVTAs would lead the assault. At dawn on November 20th, 1943, from decks of troop ships anchored miles offshore, 18 LVTA WWIIs of the 2nd Armored Amphibian Battalion were hoisted by cranes into the water. Their engines roared to life as they circled and formed up behind the first waves of troop-carrying LVT-1s. The plan was bold and untested. No armored amphibious assault had ever been attempted against a fortified beach. Each vehicle carried a 5-man crew: commander, driver, gunner, loader, and radio operator. They were the first tankers in history to enter combat from the sea. As the fleet opened fire with a massive pre-invasion bombardment, the LVTs began their long approach toward the reef. Shells from battleships shattered the air. Columns of water erupted over Betio as carrier aircraft strafed the beaches. But deep beneath the bombardment, the Japanese still waited. They had endured naval fire before. They knew the Americans would come, and when the shelling stopped, they raised their guns and prepared for the slaughter they believed was inevitable. What Admiral Shibazaki did not know was that the coral reef he trusted would no longer save him. At low tide, when conventional landing craft would have run aground hundreds of yards offshore, the LVTs would keep moving, grinding forward, their treads biting into the coral. The Americans were about to prove that not even the ocean could stop a tank. On the eve of the assault, General Julian Smith addressed his Marines aboard the USS Zealand. "You will attack across open reef and beach, and you will take Tarawa. There will be no reserve." Every man knew what that meant. The new amphibious tanks were their spearhead, and their only shield. When the sun rose over Tarawa, the Pacific would witness a revolution in warfare. Steel would crawl out of the sea, and the Japanese would face an enemy they never imagined could reach them. Inside an LVTA, the noise was overwhelming. Engines screamed beneath the floor plates, treads clattered against steel rollers, and the roar of surf pounded against the hull. Visibility was almost non-existent. Narrow slits offered fleeting glimpses of horizon and spray. For the Marines who manned them, it felt less like riding a tank and more like steering a submarine through chaos. The salt air burned the lungs. Waves slapped against the sides, flooding the floor. Every few seconds, the turret shook under the concussion of its own gun. Most crews were barely 20 years old. They had trained for months, but no amount of drills could prepare them for the fear of sinking, of being trapped inside a steel coffin, surrounded by water and fire. Private First Class Richard Hanley, a gunner from the 2nd Amphibian Battalion, later recalled, "You didn't breathe until you hit sand. Until then, you just prayed the engine didn't quit." Yet, even in terror, there was trust in the machine, in the crew, in the mission. They were told their tanks would be the first onto the beach, clearing the way for thousands of infantry behind them. There was no turning back. When the hatches sealed and the LVTs rolled off the ramps of their landing ships, the world outside disappeared. Only vibration and hope remained. These were not faceless machines. They were human lungs inside armor. The LVTA was both a marvel and a compromise. It was not built from scratch as a tank, but evolved from necessity. The U.S. Marine Corps lacked the luxury of time. The Pacific Campaign moved faster than traditional development cycles could allow. So engineers took what already worked, the amphibious transport LVT, and armed it. Armor plates were bolted onto aluminum hulls. The result was barely resistant to rifle fire. Even .50 caliber rounds could sometimes pierce the thinner panels near the rear. But the trade-off was weight. Any heavier, and it would no longer float. Propulsion was a delicate balance of physics and courage. In the water, twin propellers driven by the same engine that powered the treads pushed the vehicle forward. On land, the propellers disengaged automatically as the treads took over. The moment of transition, when a tank left the water and hit sand, was often the most dangerous. One wrong throttle input, and the machine could stall, half-submerged and immobile. The turret of the LVT-A1 housed a 37mm gun capable of firing armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Later models, like the LVT-A4, replaced it with a 75mm howitzer, turning the amphibious tank into a floating assault gun. These could engage Japanese bunkers with devastating effect. What made these designs extraordinary was not perfection, but adaptation. Every vehicle was a fusion of shipbuilding, tank engineering, and improvisation. Welders in Hawaiian shipyards often modified them on the fly, cutting new armor from scrapped steel, mounting extra .50 caliber machine guns, and sealing hatches with tar and canvas. Each improvement was born from experience and blood. Before the introduction of the LVTA, amphibious warfare followed a predictable pattern. Bombardment, infantry landing, slow buildup of armor afterward. That sequence often cost thousands of lives. Infantrymen stormed beaches under machine gun fire without tank support until engineers could bring in landing craft large enough for Shermans. The amphibious tank reversed that order. Now, armor led the charge. In the new doctrine, LVTAs formed the first wave, firing as they approached the shore. Their job was to destroy Japanese strongpoints and suppress defenders, while troop-carrying Amtraks followed close behind. The tanks' high silhouette and open-topped turrets gave excellent visibility, but also made them vulnerable. Coordination was key. From the command ships offshore, naval observers relayed firing corrections by radio. Carrier aircraft marked targets with smoke. Battleships ceased fire at the last possible moment to avoid hitting their own advancing armor. It was a dangerous ballet, a fusion of sea, land, and air unlike anything seen before. At Tarawa, it was this orchestration that allowed Marines to finally breach the island's perimeter. For the first time, the U.S. had a mechanized spearhead that could rise from the sea itself. The Japanese never anticipated this kind of attack. Their defenses were built to stop men and landing craft, not tanks climbing out of the surf. Every LVTA that reached shore became a fortress, shielding advancing infantry and blasting open pillboxes that had survived naval bombardment. Each vehicle destroyed made the next few yards of beach possible. From human courage to mechanical innovation, from tactics written in theory to chaos written in salt and blood, the amphibious tank was not just a machine. It was the bridge between the ocean and victory. But the Japanese defenders, watching from their bunkers, saw something else entirely. The crumbling of a belief that had protected their empire for centuries. For the Japanese on Tarawa and later Saipan, the appearance of amphibious tanks defied everything they understood about warfare. Their intelligence had known of American landing craft, but tanks that swam, that was a fantasy, an impossibility. Colonel Shibasaki Keiji, the Japanese commander at Tarawa, had once declared that 1,000,000 men could not take this island in 100 years. His confidence came from geography. The coral reefs around Betio stretched hundreds of yards offshore, too shallow for landing ships, too jagged for heavy vehicles. He had assumed American tanks would founder in the reef, forcing the Marines to wade ashore under withering machine gun fire. But when the LVTAs emerged from the sea, his defense plans began to unravel in minutes. Gunfire from the beach ricocheted harmlessly off the tank's sloped armor. 37mm and 75mm shells tore through bunkers that had resisted naval bombardment. Mortars that once pinned down infantry now fell short or exploded too late. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight infantry, now faced steel monsters that rolled over trenches and climbed sea walls. Panic spread among defenders unprepared for armor at such close quarters. In later battles, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Imperial Army engineers scrambled to adapt. They dug deeper gun pits, mined coral approaches, and deployed more anti-tank rifles. But the shock had already changed their mindset. For the first time, the Japanese defensive doctrine began to account for tanks from the sea. By then, it was too late. The psychological blow had already landed. Behind every amphibious tank was a leader who refused to accept impossible. One of them was Donald Roebling, a civilian inventor from Florida. Long before the war, he had designed the original Alligator, a rescue vehicle for hurricane victims. When the U.S. Marine Corps saw it in 1937, they immediately recognized potential far beyond disaster relief. By 1941, the Alligator had evolved into the LVT, landing vehicle, tracked. Its transformation from civilian tool to military spearhead was guided by visionaries like General Alexander Vandegrift, Major General Holland Smith, and Brigadier General Harry Schmidt. These officers saw the Pacific not as a battlefield of islands, but as an oceanic chessboard, where each move demanded mobility between land and sea. Their belief in innovation often faced skepticism from traditional commanders. Some argued that tanks belonged on land, not water. Others feared that resources spent on such experiments would detract from proven weapons. But the Pacific War was not conventional. It demanded solutions that no manual had written. By 1943, with Tarawa looming, Marine leadership made a decision that would define the next 2 years of fighting. Amphibious tanks would lead the landings. It was a gamble, one that could have drowned hundreds of men and exposed a generation of design flaws. Instead, it redefined amphibious warfare forever. The success of the LVTA and its successors reshaped Allied planning from the Central Pacific to the Philippines. Once proven, the concept of amphibious armor became a cornerstone of island-hopping strategy. At Saipan in June 1944, LVTA-4s with 75mm howitzers led the first assault wave, crushing Japanese fortifications before the infantry even touched land. At Tinian, tanks crossed specially built ramps from landing ships directly into shallow water. A.B. Perfect demonstration of synchronized engineering and tactical foresight. Every successful operation reinforced a truth the Allies had learned at terrible cost. Whoever could dominate the shoreline controlled the battle. The Japanese Empire's vast network of island fortresses, designed to repel traditional invasions, became vulnerable from every direction. The ocean, once their barrier, had turned against them. Even in Europe, British planners studying the Pacific Campaign took notice. The concept of amphibious armor would later influence designs for the DD, duplex-drive Sherman, used during the D-Day landings in Normandy. What began as a desperate experiment in the Pacific became the prototype for modern amphibious assault. Every amphibious landing demanded courage, not just from the soldiers on the beach, but from the men inside those floating tanks who went first, who faced death before anyone else stepped ashore. Many crews never made it. Some tanks struck coral heads and sank instantly. trapping men inside. Others burned when enemy shells hit fuel tanks. Survivors often swam the last yards through fire and debris, carrying their comrades' dog tags in silence. Yet, when the call came for the next island, they went again. Their courage wasn't celebrated like the great naval victories or air duels of the Pacific, but it was just as vital. Without them, every beachhead might have been another Tarawa, a massacre. The amphibious tank became a symbol not of power, but of perseverance. A reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, still depended on the hearts of those who operated it. And it was that blend, machine and man, that turned the tide across the Pacific. Stage was now set for one of the war's most dramatic turning points when these steel beasts met the full fury of Japan's defenses head-on at the edge of coral and fire. The morning of the Tarawa landing began under a false calm. At 05, U.S. Navy battleships opened fire, a thunderous barrage that turned the horizon into flame. Columns of smoke rose from the small atoll, and men aboard the transports cheered, believing nothing could have survived that bombardment. But the Japanese had dug deep. Their bunkers, reinforced with coconut logs, sand, and concrete, were nearly impervious. When the shelling stopped, hundreds of defenders climbed back to their guns, ready to meet the landing force at 9. Our sentencing. The first wave of LVT-A1s rolled down the ramps of their landing ships. They entered the water nose first, engines churning, treads biting into the surf. From a distance, they looked fragile, toy tanks bobbing in the Pacific swell. Then came the first shock. The tide was too low. Naval intelligence had misjudged the reef depth. Standard Higgins boats could not pass. Only the amphibious tanks, the LVT-As, could cross. The plan changed in seconds. The tanks were ordered to go on alone. Without infantry to support them, 18 amphibious tanks advanced toward the reef. Their engines screamed against the current as they climbed over coral heads and shallow pools. The sea turned to foam under their treads. When they reached the reef, the Japanese opened fire. Machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and 75mm field pieces erupted from bunkers and pillboxes along the shore. Tracer rounds stitched the surface of the water, striking tanks mid-approach. One LVT-A took a direct hit through the side armor. It erupted in flames, sinking within minutes. But the rest pressed forward. At 400 yards from shore, the 37mm and 75mm guns of the LVT-As began to reply. Shells exploded among the Japanese positions, smashing concrete bunkers and tearing apart sandbag emplacements. Flames flickered through the haze. Marines aboard shouted through radios, calling targets as best they could through static and smoke. The tanks reached the beach. For the first time in modern history, armored vehicles had climbed directly from the sea into combat. They rolled onto the sand, treads grinding coral and bone, their turrets swiveling toward the airfields beyond. Behind them, infantry-laden Amtraks followed, using the wrecks of disabled tanks as cover. The fighting on the beach was chaos. Japanese defenders poured automatic fire from concealed bunkers, snipers hid in palm trunks, and mortars rained down from the airfield. The LVT-As, though thinly armored, provided crucial suppressive fire. They blew apart gun nests that threatened to stall the landing. Many tanks did not survive the first hour. Some were hit by direct fire from anti-boat guns. Others bogged down in soft sand or were immobilized by broken treads. Yet, every destroyed tank bought time. Every wreck became a shield for Marines crawling forward under fire. By noon, smoke had turned the sky orange. The heat on the beach was unbearable. The smell of salt, diesel, and cordite filled the air. Communication lines were tangled or cut, and command was nearly impossible. Still, the amphibious tanks kept firing. Tank commanders, standing waist-high in their open turrets, directed infantry through hand signals, their faces blackened with soot. In several cases, crews abandoned their disabled vehicles and joined the infantry with carbines and grenades. The price was immense. Of the 44 LVTAs that entered the water at Tarawa, fewer than half were operational by nightfall. Some were destroyed by artillery. Others were simply swallowed by the sea. But the beach was taken. For 3 days, fighting raged across the tiny island. Japanese defenders launched suicidal counterattacks at night, infiltrating through wreckage and shell craters. The tanks, even when stationary, served as fixed gun positions, their cannons lighting up the darkness with each shot. When the final Japanese bunker fell on November 23rd, only 17 LVTAs were still running. Yet their impact had been decisive. Without them, the Marines would have been slaughtered in the surf, trapped against the reef like targets in an open field. The amphibious tanks had done what no one thought possible. They had turned the ocean into a battlefield that favored the attacker. The lessons of Tarawa were written in blood. Engineers learned the limits of armor and buoyancy. Commanders understood the cost of underestimating the tide. But more importantly, they realized they had discovered the blueprint for every future landing. And the next time, they would return with better tanks, stronger guns, and new confidence that no beach was beyond reach. That next test would come less than 6 months later, on the volcanic sands of Saipan, where Japanese firepower and terrain would push the amphibious tanks to their ultimate trial. Dawn came to Saipan under the thunder of naval guns. The island, larger and far deadlier than Tarawa, was the gateway to Japan's inner defenses. If the Americans captured it, their long-range B-29 bombers could strike Tokyo itself. The Japanese knew this, and they were prepared to fight to the last man. From the decks of hundreds of landing ships, the sea looked alive. Thousands of craft stretched to the horizon, each carrying men, machines, or supplies. Among them were the successors to Tarawa's fragile pioneers, the LVTA-4s, now equipped with heavier armor and 75 mm howitzers. They would spearhead the assault on the island's western shore, where coral shelves and reef-studded shallows once again threatened to trap the landing force. At 07 Uru, the command came over the radio. "Land the first wave!" The LVTAs lurched forward, slipping off their ramps into the blue-green water. Their propellers churned foam. Their crews braced against the recoil of the surf. Behind them, the roar of naval bombardment faded, replaced by the sharp rhythm of the engines and the whine of incoming fire. Japanese coastal batteries opened up immediately. Shells erupted across the approach line. Water spouts rose like pillars around the advancing vehicles. Several tanks disappeared in seconds, torn apart beneath the surface. But the formation pressed on, slow, methodical, unstoppable. Within minutes, the lead vehicles reached the reef. They climbed, treads clawing against coral slick with algae, then slid down the far side toward the lagoon. At 600 yards, the tanks began to fire. Their 75 mm howitzers thundered against the shoreline, smashing pillboxes and trench lines. High explosive shells burst among palm trees and bunkers, clearing paths for the amphibious tractors following close behind. Then came the wall of fire. Japanese machine guns swept the waterline, tracers crisscrossing the foam. Mortars dropped around the landing craft, showering fragments over open decks. Infantrymen crouched behind the low armor of their LVTs, waiting for the moment of impact. By 08 WWII, the first wave reached the beach and immediately found itself in a killing zone. Japanese defenders had sighted their guns perfectly. Hidden artillery emplacements in the cliffs rained shells down into the landing zone. The ground trembled under explosions. One tank, hit through the turret, burst into flames. The crew escaped only to be cut down on the sand. Another was flipped onto its side by a direct hit. Yet others broke through. Their tracks ground forward, crushing wire entanglements, flattening trenches, and firing point-blank into cave openings. The Marines followed close behind, using the tanks as moving cover. Together, man and machine fought their way inland through the chaos. By midday, the first American foothold was secured, but at terrible cost. More than half the amphibious tanks in the first wave were disabled or destroyed. The beach was littered with twisted hulls, burning fuel, and bodies. Still, the assault had succeeded. The Japanese line was fractured. Without the amphibious tanks to break the initial resistance, the Marines might have been pinned to the surf again, as they were at Tarawa. Commanders on the flagship USS Pennsylvania watched through binoculars as smoke drifted inland. The radio chatter told the story. Tanks on the beach. Tanks advancing. Tanks still firing. Hours later, Sherman tanks landed from LST's landing ship tank to reinforce the LVTAs, turning the shallow beachhead into a steel bastion. The combined armor began pushing across the island, street by street, bunker by bunker. Japanese counterattacks came at dusk. Hundreds of soldiers charged through the smoke, screaming, some armed only with grenades or bayonets. They swarmed the tanks, climbing onto hulls, trying to jam explosives into exhaust vents. Crews fought back from inside their turrets, firing machine guns until barrels overheated. Some tanks disappeared beneath waves of men before the explosions consumed them. Others held their ground, their engines glowing red in the night. The battle for Saipan turned into one of the bloodiest engagements of the Pacific. By June 22nd, the Japanese garrison was shattered. American armor had reached the island's northern ridges, cutting off escape. The final act came days later, the largest banzai charge of the war, when over 3,000 Japanese soldiers hurled themselves against the American lines. The LVTAs, now battle-scarred and smoke-blackened, stood among the defenders, their howitzers firing point-blank into the massed attackers. When silence returned, the beaches that had once been death traps were now the arteries of victory. Saipan's fall stunned the Japanese high command. The impossible had happened again. American armor had crossed the sea and climbed the beaches. No island, no reef, no barrier was safe anymore. Within weeks, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed. For the first time, Japan faced the full reach of Allied power. From the captured airfields on Saipan and Tinian, American bombers began their relentless campaign toward the Japanese mainland. The amphibious tanks had been more than weapons. They were symbols, proof that technology and determination could breach even the most fortified frontiers. What began as a desperate gamble at Tarawa had now become a doctrine, the foundation of the island-hopping strategy that would carry the Allies to Okinawa and, eventually, the doorstep of Japan itself. The Pacific War was far from over, but its direction had changed forever. From Tarawa to Saipan, the amphibious tanks had rewritten the logic of invasion, and in doing so, had reshaped the fate of an empire built on islands. The victories at Tarawa and Saipan came at a staggering price. Each stretch of sand gained had been bought with blood and fire, and each amphibious tank left behind was a silent witness to that cost. In the days after the landings, Marines walked among the wrecks scattered across the beaches. The once floating machines now sat half buried in the surf, their armor torn open, turrets twisted by explosions. The sea had already begun to reclaim them, waves washing over open hatches. Mechanics inspected what could be salvaged. Most could not. Engines were flooded, hulls punctured by armor-piercing shells, and transmissions ruined by coral debris. Of the more than 40 LVTAs deployed at Tarawa, fewer than 20 were still functional by the end. At Saipan, over half were destroyed within hours of landing, but the results spoke for themselves. Amphibious armor had proven its worth and its necessity. Without it, the U.S. Marine Corps would have faced annihilation at the water's edge. The losses were acceptable only because they opened the way for something greater: the evolution of amphibious warfare. In the months that followed, engineers and tacticians worked relentlessly to refine what they had learned in blood. New variants emerged, stronger, faster, and better armed. The LVT-4 Buffalo introduced a rear ramp for rapid infantry deployment. The LVT-A5 carried stabilized 75mm howitzers and improved radios for coordinated strikes. Each new design pushed the concept closer to perfection, a true hybrid between ship and tank. The transformation was not just mechanical, it was strategic. Before the Pacific campaigns, amphibious operations were seen as desperate, last-resort tactics, risky gambles that could end in disaster. Tarawa changed that. Now, every major island operation began with the question, how many LVTs do we have? At Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the first waves of every landing were armored and mobile. The lessons of the reef had been burned into Marine Corps doctrine. Commanders rewrote training manuals, teaching new generations of Marines to coordinate with amphibious armor. Beach reconnaissance units learned to map tidal patterns and coral heads with unprecedented precision. For the first time, amphibious assault became a science, a fusion of oceanography, engineering, and tactics. The U.S. Navy adapted alongside them. Landing ship, tanks, LSTs, were redesigned to carry dozens of LVTs directly to the front lines. Special recovery units were formed to repair damaged vehicles even while under fire. Every step represented a new level of cooperation between sea and land forces, a unity of purpose that would eventually culminate in the massive, amphibious fleets seen at Okinawa and Normandy. The true psychological dimension of the LVTA's success cannot be overstated. For the Marines, it was proof that no fortress was invincible. The reef at Tarawa, once thought impassable, had become a stepping stone. Confidence surged across the Pacific commands. For the Japanese, it was a warning written in fire. Their defensive lines had been built around the assumption that the ocean itself was their ally, that coral, tides, and distance would cripple any invading force. Now, those natural barriers had turned into liabilities. Reports from Tarawa and Saipan described American floating tanks with almost mythical fear. Many Japanese soldiers believed they were indestructible. Commanders rushed to fortify inland positions, but morale had already cracked. In letters recovered from Saipan's defenders, one Japanese officer wrote, "They come from the sea as if the sea itself carries them." There is no safety now, not even at the water's edge. The myth of the unassailable island was gone. By late 1944, the Pacific War was entering a new phase. The United States no longer fought just for footholds. It fought for approach. Each island seized became a runway, each beachhead a launch pad for the next assault. Amphibious tanks continued to evolve alongside the campaign. Their role expanded from assault vehicles to mobile artillery and armored transport. They supported infantry deep inland, crushed counterattacks, and served as command vehicles on chaotic battlefields. The Japanese adapted too, developing heavier anti-tank weapons, more complex defenses, and suicide tactics. Yet, the pattern remained. The Americans would land, establish armor on the beach, and push inland, a rhythm of invasion that no force could reverse. The cost was immense, but the momentum was irreversible. And as the war rolled toward the Marianas and the Philippines, the amphibious tank became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of America's ability to conquer not just land, but the sea itself. By late 1944, the lessons of Tarawa and Saipan had rippled across the entire Pacific theater. Where once there had been uncertainty, There was now doctrine, tested, refined, and lethal. The U.S. had unlocked a new kind of warfare, mobility without dependence on ports or piers. The ability to strike anywhere a beach existed. At Peleliu in September 1944, the LVT-A-4s were used to devastating effect, leading the charge onto coral shores so treacherous that even landing craft struggled to reach them. Despite the island's brutal heat and entrenched Japanese resistance, the amphibious armor allowed the Marines to maintain fire superiority during those first critical hours. In the Philippines, entire flotillas of LVTs carried infantry and supplies across open sea, rivers, and swamps. Some traveled nearly 50 miles inland from the beaches, performing roles no one had imagined when the first prototypes were drawn up in Florida just a few years earlier. The Japanese, though adapting, could never fully counter the versatility of these machines. Every attempt to destroy them with artillery or mines only reinforced the need for more and heavier amphibious armor on the Allied side. Behind the engineering triumph and tactical brilliance was human endurance and loss. For every successful landing, dozens of amphibious tank crews paid the price of innovation with their lives. The hazards were constant. Water leaks, mechanical failure, exposure to fire from above, and the ever-present risk of drowning. There were no rear lines for the first wave. Once the hatches closed and the tank rolled into the surf, a crew's survival depended entirely on luck, skill, and a machine designed for a war unlike any before. Survivors often spoke of the silence after the landings, how, when the beach was finally taken, the ocean behind them seemed eerily calm. They knew that calm was temporary, that another island, another reef, awaited. By the end of the Pacific War, more than 8,000 LVTs of various types had been built. They carried Marines across dozens of beaches, from Kwajalein to Okinawa. Thousands of their operators never returned, but their legacy endured, carved into the doctrine of modern amphibious warfare and remembered in the rusting hulls that still rest beneath Pacific surf. What began as an American innovation quickly reshaped global military thinking. British and Commonwealth forces adopted the concept, developing their own amphibious vehicles inspired by U.S. successes for operations in Burma and eventually Europe. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, British and American forces deployed amphibious Shermans, DD tanks, that shared the same DNA as the LVTs of Tarawa. The Pacific had been the proving ground. Europe became the stage for their perfection. The world had entered the age of amphibious mobility, where no coastline could guarantee safety. After the war, the technology continued to evolve. The Cold War's geopolitical map demanded flexibility, and the concept of combined land-sea assault became central to U.S. Marine and Army doctrine. Modern amphibious vehicles, like the AAVP-7A1 used through the late 20th century, traced their lineage directly back to those early, fragile LVTAs that had clawed up the beaches under Japanese fire. For Japan, the psychological wound never healed. The empire that had once ruled the Pacific through its control of the sea had been undone by a weapon that blurred the line between ocean and earth. Even before the atomic bombs fell, the inevitability of defeat was clear. The amphibious tank had rendered every island fortress obsolete. Every reef and shore that once guarded Japan now seemed like a trap waiting to be breached. In less than 2 years, the United States had mastered a form of warfare no other nation could match, one that bypassed geography itself. And with that mastery, the Pacific changed forever. The end of the war would bring silence to the beaches, but not to the memory of what had risen from their waters. The next chapter was not about the machines, but what they meant, the merging of human will and mechanical ingenuity to overcome the very limits of nature. In the end, it wasn't just steel or fire that conquered the Pacific. It was imagination. The amphibious tank, ungainly, loud, and often fragile, represented something greater than machinery. It was proof that no obstacle, not even an ocean, could contain human determination once necessity demanded evolution. When those first LVTAs rolled from sea to sand, they did more than breach Japan's defenses. They redefined what it meant to fight, to adapt, and to endure. The line between land and sea, once a boundary of safety, became a fleeting illusion. For the men inside those machines, the war was measured not in miles gained or islands taken, but in the sound of engines under rising surf, the heartbeat of innovation driven by survival. They fought not just the enemy, but the elements, the reefs, the unknown. Every rusting hull that now rests beneath Pacific waves tells a quiet story of courage built on invention, and invention built on fear. The Japanese defenders who once watched the impossible unfold on Tarawa could never have known they were witnessing the dawn of a new era, one in which technology would become the tide itself, reshaping every shore it touched. By the time peace returned to the Pacific, the beaches that had been torn apart by war were silent again. Palm trees grew over broken coral, waves whispered over wreckage, but the idea remained that mankind could take the harshest lessons of battle and turn them into blueprints for progress. The amphibious tank began as an answer to a deadly problem. It ended as a symbol of boundless reach, a reminder that even in war, the drive to overcome nature's limits reveals the most human force of all: the will to adapt, survive, and move forward. And long after the thunder of engines faded, that lesson endured, carried not in steel but in memory.